The ancient station called Nexus Prime floated in the darkness between stars, orbiting a dying sun that had burned for 11 billion years. Its halls were carved from asteroid stone and lined with metals that no longer existed anywhere else in the galaxy. For 9,000 years, the Galactic Ruling Council had gathered here to decide the fate of civilizations, and today they had gathered to decide the fate of humanity. Commander Cole stood alone in the center of the great chamber, surrounded by towering seats that rose like cliffs on every side. Each seat held a representative from one of the 12 elder species, beings who had traveled between stars when humans were still learning to farm wheat and tame horses. They looked down at him with expressions that ranged from contempt to pity to cold indifference, and kept his face carefully neutral as he waited for them to speak. The high speaker of the rose from the tallest seat. His name was, and his body was made of living crystal that caught the chamber's dim light and scattered it into rainbows across the walls. He was ancient even by the standards of his species, and he had presided over the destruction of 4 civilizations during his time on the council. He looked at the way a gardener might look at a weed that had somehow grown too tall. Began to speak in a voice like breaking glass, and the translation device in his ear converted his words into flat, emotionless English. He explained that humanity had committed 17 violations of galactic statute in the past decade alone: unauthorized expansion into the Outer Rim territories, failure to submit proper colonization requests, development of weapons technology beyond the limits permitted for species of humanity's classification, refusal to accept client species status under the protection of an elder race. Listened without interrupting. He had heard all of this before during the preliminary hearings, and he knew that the charges were simply an excuse. The council did not care about statutes and regulations. They cared about control, and humanity had grown too independent to control. The High Speaker finished listing the charges and moved on to the sentence. The council had voted unanimously, he announced, to authorize a punitive expedition against human space. A combined fleet of and warships would be assembled within the week. Humanity would be given a simple choice when the fleet arrived. They could surrender their colony worlds and accept permanent client species status, or they could be destroyed. A holographic display flickered to life in the center of the chamber, showing a detailed simulation of the coming battle. 12,000 alien warships moved toward Earth in perfect formation, their weapons charging as they approached the human defensive line. 800 human vessels rose to meet them, and within moments the simulation showed those vessels burning and breaking apart under concentrated fire. The simulation ran for 6 standard days before the last human ship was destroyed, and Earth itself lay exposed to orbital bombardment. Explained that the mathematics were irrefutable. The Council's combined fleet humanity by a factor of 15 to 1. Human ships were smaller, less armored, and equipped with weapons that could barely scratch the hulls of dreadnoughts. The simulation had been run over 1,000 times with every possible variable accounted for, and humanity lost in every single scenario. Average time to complete defeat was 5.7 standard days. The most optimistic projection for human resistance was 8 days. The least optimistic was 3. Looked up at the holographic display showing the destruction of everything he had sworn to protect. He watched Earth burn in simulated fire while the Council waited for him to beg for mercy. He knew that this was the moment they savored most, the moment when young species finally understood that they were nothing compared to the ancient powers that ruled the galaxy. He was supposed to fall to his knees and plead for better terms, to offer anything and everything if only they would spare his world. Instead, he smiled. The expression was small and brief, barely noticeable unless someone was watching closely, and something in his crystalline features shifted when he saw that smile. For just a moment, so quickly that almost missed it, the High Speaker of the looked uncertain. Requested 3 standard days to return to Earth and relay the Council's terms to his government. This was his right under galactic law, and even the council could not deny a condemned species the chance to consider surrender. Granted the request with a dismissive wave of his crystalline hand. 3 days would change nothing. Humanity could spend that time preparing for war or preparing for submission, but the outcome would be the same regardless. Bowed formally to the council, turned on his heel, and walked out of the chamber without looking back. His footsteps echoed through the ancient halls of Nexus Prime as he made his way to the docking bay where his shuttle waited. Alien diplomats and functionaries watched him pass, and he could feel their eyes on his back, measuring him, dismissing him, already writing humanity off as another failed experiment in the long history of the galaxy. He reached his shuttle and sealed the door behind him. The small vessel's engines hummed to life as it detached from the station and began its journey toward the jump point that would take him home. Only when he was alone in the darkness between stars did allow himself to exhale. He opened a secure communication channel using encryption protocols that the Council had never managed to crack. The face of Admiral Lisa appeared on his screen, her hair pulled back severely from a face that had seen 60 years of service to humanity. She was sitting in the war room beneath the Rocky Mountains, surrounded by displays showing fleet positions across human space. She asked him what the Council had decided and told her everything. The charges and the sentence and the simulation showing humanity's inevitable defeat. He told her about the fleet of 12,000 ships and the 6-day timeline and the absolute confidence in his voice as he pronounced humanity's doom. Admiral listened without interrupting, her face revealing nothing. When finished his report, she was silent for a long moment, and he could see her mind working behind those calm eyes. Finally, she asked him one question. She asked if the Council had given any indication that they suspected what humanity had been preparing for the past 15 years. Shook his head. They had no idea. They saw smaller ships in fewer numbers and a younger civilization, and they calculated conventional military strength the way they had always calculated it. They did not understand that humans had never fought conventional wars. They did not understand that the moment humanity first encountered alien life, they had begun preparing for exactly this scenario. Admiral nodded once, and something cold and sharp entered her expression. Good, she said, they chose wrong. She ended the transmission, and shuttle continued its journey toward home, carrying with it the first whisper of a storm that the Galactic Council could not imagine. Admiral Lisa had spent 40 years preparing for a war that everyone told her would never come. When humanity first made contact with the Galactic Council, the politicians and the optimists had celebrated. They believed that joining the community of spacefaring civilizations would bring peace and prosperity, and a golden age of cooperation. Lisa had smiled and nodded and said all the right things in public, but in private she had begun building something else entirely. She stood now in the war room beneath the Rocky Mountains, a facility that officially did not exist, surrounded by officers who had devoted their careers to a mission they could never speak about. Holographic displays covered every wall, showing the positions of human ships across dozens of star systems. Red icons marked the approaching alien fleet, still 3 days away from the border of human space, moving with the slow confidence of predators who knew their prey could not escape. Commander Daniel Park stood at her right hand, a compact man with quick eyes and a mind that worked like a precision instrument. He led the Asymmetric Warfare Division, a department that appeared in no official records and answered to no one except the Admiral herself. For 15 years, his people had been doing things that would horrify the Galactic Council if they ever learned about them. Lieutenant Commander Maria Santos completed the inner circle, a young woman with dark hair and an expression of focused intensity that never seemed to waver. She was the finest technical mind humanity had ever produced, and she had spent the last decade building weapons that the elder species could not imagine because they had never needed to imagine them. Admiral addressed her assembled commanders with the calm clarity that had defined her entire career. She explained that the Council's arrogance was their critical weakness. They had studied human military history, she said, but they had learned nothing from it. They looked at humanity and saw a young species with inferior technology and limited territory. They calculated conventional military strength because conventional military strength was all they understood. The elder species had not fought a real war in 3,000 years. They had crushed primitive civilizations and absorbed client species and conducted police actions against minor rebels, but they had never faced an enemy that could genuinely threaten them. They had grown complacent in their power, so certain of their superiority that they could not imagine anything else. They expected humanity to fight the way every other species had fought, with ships against ships and weapons against weapons, matching strength against strength until the weaker side broke. Humanity would not fight that way. Commander Park activated a display showing a web of glowing lines spread across the galaxy like a nervous system. He explained that for 15 years, human intelligence operatives had been mapping every weakness in the elder species infrastructure. They knew the location of every faster-than-light communication relay that connected the fleet to it. They knew which fuel depots supplied which sectors and how long ships could operate without resupply. They knew the command hierarchies and the chains of authority and the personal rivalries between admirals. Most importantly, they knew about the code. Every warship ran on operating systems that had not been significantly updated in 800 years. The AN used similar architecture, purchased from contractors who had convinced them that there was no need to develop their own. Why would they need to innovate when their technology already worked perfectly and no enemy could challenge them anyway? Human agents had spent a decade infiltrating the networks that maintained these systems. Technicians who appeared to be ordinary workers had planted packages of dormant code deep in the most essential functions of alien warships: navigation systems, weapons targeting, shield harmonics, life support. The packages lay sleeping beneath the surface of the operating systems, invisible to every diagnostic scan, waiting for the signal that would wake them. Lieutenant Commander Santos explained the technical details to the assembled officers. Human ships were smaller and fewer than the approaching armada, but they had been designed with a different philosophy entirely. While the elder species built massive dreadnoughts meant to intimidate and overwhelm through sheer size, humans had built vessels that were fast and adaptable and equipped with technology the Council had never encountered in combat. Electromagnetic pulse generators that could shut down unshielded systems across thousands of kilometers. Quantum communication arrays that could not be jammed or intercepted. Point defense networks controlled by artificial intelligences that processed targeting data faster than any organic mind could follow. And weapons that had been designed not to match alien firepower, but to circumvent it entirely. Admiral gave the order to begin. Across human space, ships that had been waiting in hidden positions began moving to their assigned coordinates. Civilian vessels received quiet instructions to evacuate from border regions. Ground installations that had been disguised as mining operations or research stations powered up weapons that had never been tested in actual combat. On 14 different worlds scattered across Council space, sleeper teams received activation codes that they had waited years to use. These were the ghosts, human operatives who had lived among alien populations for so long that they had almost forgotten their original mission. They moved now through the corridors of space stations and the streets of alien cities, making their way to positions that would allow them to do terrible things when the time came. The Council's fleet continued its advance toward human space, broadcasting demands for surrender on all frequencies. High Commander stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the distance to the human border shrink with every passing hour. He waited for the panicked distress calls and desperate pleas for mercy that always came when inferior species finally understood what they were facing. He received only silence. His communication officers reported that human channels had gone dark. No military transmissions, no civilian chatter, no diplomatic messages requesting negotiations. It was as if humanity had simply vanished, leaving nothing behind but empty space and silent planets. Dismissed his officers' concerns. The silence meant nothing. Humans were probably arguing among themselves about whether to fight or surrender, wasting their final hours in the futile debates that young species always indulged in. They would find their voices soon enough, when his fleet crossed into their territory, and they finally understood that their choices had narrowed to submission or death. He ordered his fleet to maintain course and speed. In 3 days they would reach the human border. In 6 days the war would be over. In a month the Council would be dividing human territory among its member species, and the brief inconvenience of humanity would be forgotten. He could not see the web of sleeper agents waking across his supply lines. He could not see the dormant code stirring in the depths of his own ship's operating systems. He could not see Admiral Lisa standing in her war room beneath the Rocky Mountains, watching his fleet approach with the patience of a spider watching a fly move toward its web. The trap was set. All that remained was for the Council's arrogance to spring it. High Commander stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, and watched human space grow larger with every passing moment. Behind him stretched the most powerful armada assembled in 900 years, 12,000 warships arranged in perfect formation like a wall of gleaming death moving through the darkness between stars. Each vessel was a masterpiece of engineering, crewed by warriors who had trained for decades, armed with weapons that could crack planets open like eggs. He almost the humans. Every young species believed they were special. Every upstart civilization thought they would somehow be different from the dozens that had come before, that they would find some trick or strategy or hidden strength that would let them resist the inevitable. None of them ever did. The mathematics of galactic power were absolute, and no amount of courage or cleverness could change them. The fleet crossed into human territory at precisely the moment had calculated. He stood as the border passed beneath his ships, savoring the knowledge that he was now officially conducting a military operation against a hostile species. His ancestors had conquered 17 civilizations during the expansion era, and he was proud to continue that legacy. When this brief campaign was over, his name would be recorded alongside theirs in the great histories of the people. He waited for the human response. By now they must have detected his fleet on their long-range sensors. By now they must be scrambling their pathetic defense forces and sending frantic messages to their government demanding instructions. By now the panic should be spreading through their population like fire through dry grass. His communication officers reported nothing. The silence continued, deep and complete and somehow unsettling in its totality. Told himself that this meant nothing. Humans were simply frozen with fear, too terrified to even organize a response. Their paralysis would make his victory even easier. Then his sensor officer made a sound that had never heard from before. It was a soft, choked noise, almost like a gasp, and when the High Commander turned to look at him, he saw something in those crystalline features that should not have been possible. He saw fear. The sensor officer reported that his instruments were malfunctioning. Navigation systems across the fleet were showing contradictory data, placing ships in locations they could not possibly occupy. Communication arrays were filling with ghost signals that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, and weapon systems had begun cycling through diagnostic modes that no one had ordered and no one could override. Demanded explanations. He demanded that his technicians identify the source of these malfunctions and correct them immediately. He demanded to know how such failures could occur simultaneously across 12,000 vessels that had been inspected and certified before departure. His technicians had no answers. They ran diagnostic after diagnostic, their crystalline fingers dancing across control surfaces, their voices growing more confused and frightened with each passing moment. The problems were spreading. Systems that had functioned perfectly for centuries were suddenly behaving in ways that made no sense. It was as if the ships themselves had been possessed by some malevolent intelligence. Then every speaker on every ship in the fleet crackled to life, and a human voice began to speak. Commander Cole spoke calmly, almost conversationally, as if he were discussing the weather with an old friend rather than addressing an invading armada. He apologized for the inconvenience that the fleet was experiencing and explained that it was unfortunately necessary. He hoped that the crews would not be too alarmed by what was happening to their ships. He explained that human infiltration teams had spent the last 15 years planting quantum viral packages in, and computer systems. These packages had been dormant until now, hidden so deep in the operating code that no scan could detect them, waiting for the signal that would bring them to life. Every ship in the fleet was now running human code beneath its primary operating systems. Every weapon, every shield, every navigation computer, every life support unit had been compromised. Roared for his technicians to purge the infected systems. He would not be held hostage by some human trick. He would not be humiliated by a species that should have been crushed beneath boots. The technicians reported that purging the infected systems was impossible. The viral packages had woven themselves into essential functions. Removing them would require shutting down life support, engines, and weapons simultaneously. The fleet would become a collection of frozen tombs drifting through space. Commander Cole continued speaking, his voice patient and almost kind. He explained that humans were not soldiers in the way that the elder species understood the term. Humans did not march in formation or follow predictable doctrines or fight according to established rules. Humans were survivors. They had evolved on a planet that tried to kill them every day, competing against predators and parasites and each other for every scrap of food and every breath of air. They had learned long ago that the species which fights fair is the species which goes extinct. "We do not fight fair," Commander Cole said. "We never have, we never will." Watched his beautiful fleet hang motionless in space, 12,000 ships reduced to helpless targets by an enemy they had never even seen. His weapons could not fire. His shields could not activate. His engines could not maneuver. He could not even communicate with his own vessels except through the channel that the humans had opened for him. He thought about the simulation that the Council had shown him before the fleet departed. He thought about the confident predictions of victory in 6 days, the mathematical certainty of human defeat. He thought about how the Council had laughed at the idea that humans could pose any real threat to species that had ruled the stars for. He understood now that the Council had been measuring the wrong things. They had counted ships and weapons and years of technological development. They had never considered that a young species might have spent every moment since first contact preparing for exactly this situation. They had never imagined that humans might be willing to do things that civilized species would never contemplate. Commander Cole finished his message with a simple statement. He explained that humanity had no desire to destroy the fleet. No one needed to die today. The crews could evacuate in their escape pods, which remained unaffected by the viral packages, and human vessels would collect them safely. The war could end without a single life lost. But if the fleet attempted to resist, if they tried to manually override their systems or repair the damage or fight back in any way, then humans would be forced to demonstrate what their weapons could do to helpless targets. Commander Cole hoped that would not be necessary. He truly did. Stood on his darkened bridge, surrounded by officers who looked at him with expressions of confusion and dawning horror, and he realized that he had made a terrible mistake. Not just him, but the entire council, every elder species that had dismissed humanity as insignificant, everyone who had assumed that power was measured only in the size of your fleet and the age of your civilization. They had awakened something that should have been left sleeping, and now they would learn what humans did to those who threatened their existence. The human fleet emerged from hiding positions scattered throughout the star system like wolves stepping out of shadows. 800 ships against 12,000. and yet it was the 12,000 that hung helpless in the void, while the 800 moved with the precision of a well-rehearsed performance. They came from behind asteroids, and within the radiation shadows of gas giants, and from beneath the electromagnetic noise of the local sun, appearing on sensors as if they had materialized from nothing. Admiral Lisa watched from the command carrier Resolute as her fleet arranged itself around the paralyzed alien armada. Her vessels looked almost delicate compared to the massive dreadnoughts, sleek and angular where the enemy ships were bulky and intimidating. But size meant nothing when your weapons could not fire and your shields could not activate. The greatest warship ever built was just a floating coffin if it could not defend itself. She did not order an immediate attack. That was not the human way, despite what the Council believed about them. Humans were capable of terrible violence when necessary, but they were also capable of mercy, and Lisa had always believed that mercy was a strength rather than a weakness. She opened a communication channel to the Eternal Dominion and waited for High Commander to appear on her screen. The commander looked nothing like he had during the council session, where humanity's fate had been pronounced. His crystalline features were fractured with stress patterns that Lisa recognized as panic, cracks spreading through his body like ice breaking under pressure. His voice, when he spoke, had lost all of its arrogant certainty. Lisa offered him terms. She explained that no one needed to die today. The fleet could stand down and withdraw from human space. Crews could return to their escape pods if they felt unsafe on their compromised vessels, and human ships would transport them to neutral territory. Damaged systems could be restored once the fleet was safely beyond human borders. All she asked in return was that go back to the Council and deliver a message. The message was simple. Humanity was not an enemy to be conquered. Humanity was a neighbor to be respected. The next time the Council wanted something from human space, they could try asking instead of threatening. Listen to her offer with an expression that shifted from disbelief to fury to something that might have been shame. His ancestors had never surrendered to anyone. His species had built an empire that spanned thousands of worlds through strength and will and the absolute refusal to accept defeat. To submit now, to a species that his people considered barely civilized, would be a humiliation beyond anything he could imagine. He refused. He announced that his crews would manually override their weapons systems and fight with whatever functionality they could restore. He declared that the honor of 3 empires would not permit surrender to an inferior species. He promised that even if his fleet was destroyed, reinforcements would come, and humanity would pay for this insult with the extinction of their entire civilization. Admiral listened to his defiance without expression. When he finished speaking, she was quiet for a long moment, and something cold and sad passed through her eyes. She told him that she had hoped it would not come to this. She meant it. She gave the order, and the human fleet began to move. Small squadrons of specialized vessels approached the disabled alien ships from vectors that maximized their coverage while minimizing their exposure. They did not fire conventional weapons. Instead, they deployed targeted electromagnetic pulses that completed the destruction of already compromised operating systems. Lights flickered and died across the alien fleet. Emergency, power failed. Backup systems collapsed into useless static. Escape pods began launching from ships as crews realized they could not restore power before life support failed entirely. Thousands of small vessels tumbled away from darkened hulls, their emergency beacons flashing in the void. Human ships moved to collect them rather than destroy them, tractor beams pulling the pods to safety with careful precision. Commander Daniel Park led the precision strikes against the fleet's command ships. His squadron targeted the vessels where admirals and high officers directed operations, disabling them first to prevent any organized resistance. The Eternal Dominion went dark in the 3rd minute of the operation, its crew evacuating in emergency pods that Park's ships collected with the same care they showed to every other survivor. Lieutenant Commander Maria Santos coordinated the technical teams that boarded abandoned vessels once their crews had evacuated. These teams moved through the empty corridors of alien warships, downloading databases and copying navigation charts, and extracting every secret the Council had kept for 3,000 years of military intelligence flowed into human networks within the space of an hour. The entire operation took 11 minutes from first contact to final surrender. Was brought aboard the Resolute in restraints, escorted by human marines who treated him with distant professionalism. Admiral met him in the docking bay, standing alone with her hands clasped behind her back, watching as the broken commander of the mightiest fleet in galactic history was led before her. She did not gloat. She did not mock him or remind him of his earlier arrogance. She simply looked at him with those calm eyes and spoke the truth. She told him that his calculations were wrong. She told him that the Council had measured ships and territory and years among the stars, but they had never measured what humanity was willing to do to survive. They had assumed that humans would fight like every other species, matching strength against strength until the weaker side broke. They had never imagined that humans might spend 15 years preparing an invisible war, embedding weapons in enemy systems and training agents to live among alien populations, and building an entirely new doctrine of combat that the elder species could not comprehend. The Council had made humanity into an enemy, she continued. They had threatened human worlds and human lives and everything that humans held dear. And when you made an enemy of humanity, you discovered very quickly that humans did not believe in fair fights or honorable combat or any of the other concepts that civilized species considered essential to warfare. Humans believed in winning. Humans believed in protecting their own. And humans believed that any action was justified if it meant the survival of their species. Asked her what would happen now. His voice was hollow, emptied of everything that had made him a commander of fleets and a prince of his people. Admiral told him that his crews would be fed and treated with dignity and returned to there within the month. His ships would be towed to human shipyards where they would be studied and eventually returned. And he himself would go back to the Council to explain what had happened here. She told him to make sure the Council understood one thing above all else. Humanity had shown mercy today. They had won a war in 11 minutes without killing a single enemy combatant. They had captured 9,000 ships intact and treated their prisoners with respect and compassion. But if the Council ever threatened humanity again, that mercy would not be repeated. The Galactic Ruling Council reconvened 3 weeks after the disaster that no one had predicted, and everyone was still struggling to understand. The Great Chamber on Nexus Prime felt different now, as if the ancient stone itself had absorbed the shock of what had happened and would never quite recover. Several seats were empty, their occupants too ashamed to show their faces after voting for a war that had ended in 11 humiliating minutes. The representatives who remained looked at the human delegation with expressions their species had not worn in. Uncertainty, respect, fear. Commander Cole stood in the center of the chamber, exactly where he had stood when the Council pronounced humanity's death sentence. But this time he was not alone. Admiral Lisa stood beside him, her hair pulled back severely from a face that revealed nothing of what she might be feeling. Behind them, a holographic display showed the current disposition of the former invasion fleet. 9,000 ships captured intact, floating in orbit around human shipyards where engineers were already learning the secrets of propulsion and shielding and weapons systems. Their crews had been repatriated to there with full stomachs and clean clothes, and a message that every returning soldier carried in their hearts. This is what mercy looks like. This is what humanity chose to give you instead of death. High Speaker rose to address the chamber, and his crystalline voice was quieter than before. The arrogance that had defined him for centuries seemed to have cracked along with his confidence, leaving behind something almost resembling humility. He acknowledged that the Council had made errors in judgment regarding humanity. He acknowledged that their calculations had failed to account for factors that now seemed obvious in hindsight. He acknowledged that the punitive expedition had been a mistake. Admiral raised her hand and fell silent. When she spoke, her voice carried through the chamber with quiet authority that needed no amplification. She did not gloat. She did not list humanity's grievances or remind the Council of their predictions of easy victory. She did not threaten or demand or posture. She simply presented humanity's terms for peace as if she were discussing a business arrangement between equals. Full recognition of humanity as a sovereign species, with all the rights and privileges that status entailed. Removal of all restrictions on human expansion into unclaimed territories. A permanent seat on the Galactic Ruling Council with full voting authority. And a formal acknowledgement, recorded in the great histories and broadcast across every communication network in known space, that the invasion had been an act of unprovoked aggression against a peaceful neighbor. The Council had no choice but to accept. The alternative was admitting that they intended to continue a war they had already lost, and none of them were prepared to face humanity's response to such a declaration. But Admiral was not finished. She paused after the Council voted to accept her terms, letting the silence stretch until every representative was watching her with undivided attention. Then she offered something that none of them had expected. She offered partnership. Human medical technology was centuries behind the elder species in most respects, she explained, but humans had developed treatments for diseases that alien physicians had never encountered. They had learned to regenerate damaged tissue and repair genetic defects and extend healthy through methods that came from their unique biological heritage. This knowledge could be shared freely with any species that wanted it. Human engineers had spent decades studying the infrastructure of Council space, looking for weaknesses to exploit if war became necessary. But that same knowledge could be used to strengthen rather than destroy. Fuel depots could be made more efficient. Communication relays could be upgraded. Trade routes could be optimized. Humanity was offering to help modernize systems that had grown stagnant after of complacency. And human willingness to stand beside their former enemies against threats from beyond known space. The galaxy was vast and largely unexplored, and there were things out there that even the elder species feared. Humanity had proven that they could fight in ways that no one else could imagine. That capability could protect not just human worlds, but all the worlds of Council space. Asked the question that every representative was thinking. He asked why humanity would offer friendship to species that had tried to destroy them. He asked what possible motivation could drive a young civilization to extend its hand to those who had voted for its extinction. Admiral's answer was simple. Because we know what it is to be afraid. We know what it feels like to look up at the stars and see nothing but threats. We know how isolation and paranoia can twist a species until they see enemies everywhere and allies nowhere. We lived that way for most of our history, fighting each other because we believed that competition was the only path to survival. We were wrong. Humans learned, she continued, through centuries of war and suffering and near extinction, that cooperation was stronger than conquest. They learned that the species which helped its neighbors prospered, while the species which exploited its neighbors eventually stood alone against a universe that did not care about their power or their pride. They learned that mercy was not weakness but strength, the strength to choose a better path when a worse path was easier. The Council had given humanity a choice between submission and destruction. Humanity had found a third option, and now they were offering that same choice to the Council. They could continue as they had always been, ruling through fear and crushing any species that challenged their authority, until eventually something emerged that they could not crush and their empire crumbled into dust. Or they could accept humanity's hand and build something new together, something that might actually last. The Council voted unanimously to accept humanity's offer of partnership. Perhaps they had no choice. Perhaps they saw the wisdom in its words. Perhaps they simply feared what humanity might do if they refused. The reasons did not matter. What mattered was the decision. As the human delegation prepared to depart, Commander Cole paused at the chamber's exit and looked back at the ancient station where humanity's fate had been decided twice in less than a month. He looked at the dying star beyond its viewports, the gathered representatives of civilizations older than human history, the empty seats where former enemies had once sat in judgment. For the first time since humanity reached the stars, they were not alone. They were not threatened. They were not a young species struggling to survive in a galaxy that did not want them. They were equal partners in something larger than themselves, something that might actually make the universe a better place. And it had only taken 11 minutes to earn what of expansion and warfare could never have achieved. Smiled as he walked through the door, leaving the council chamber behind. The future was uncertain, as futures always were. There would be challenges ahead, old prejudices to overcome, new conflicts to resolve. But for the first time in human history, they would face those challenges with allies at their side instead of enemies at their backs. That was worth more than any fleet. That was worth more than any weapon. That was the real victory.